I think the war in Ukraine is slowly escalating, and it will potentially expand to an actual war between NATO and Russia. I've assembled some clips from reputable scholars who, when taken as a whole, suggest to me that this war is going to escalate because the stakes are now so high for both sides that an alternative to victory is becoming unthinkable. Now I'd like to look at John Mearsheimer. For those of you who have heard of him, you've probably heard of him because he blamed the invasion of Crimea back in 2014 on NATO expansion. He's better known in academic circles, in my opinion, as being more or less the father of a particular realist theory called offensive realism. So let's see what he has to say about the Ukraine war at this point in time.
What is the mainstream Republican opinion about Ukraine, and how big is this issue going to be, the issue of the war, in the 2024 election?
I think you have to distinguish between the elites and the public. And it's very important to understand that what the public thinks here in the United States just doesn't matter very much. The elites just do what they please. There's no question that there are a lot of doubters in the public, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, and it's likely that the number of doubters will grow with time. But the question is, how's that going to affect the elite? And the argument that's being made is that the Republicans are beginning to go soft on Ukraine at the elite level, and that if Donald Trump gets elected, there's a really good chance that he'll pull the plug on the Ukrainians. This is not going to happen, in my opinion. The United States is backing Ukraine to the hilt. And if the United States withdraws its support for Ukraine, its material support, Ukraine is going to collapse. It can't stand up to the Russians. The Russians would win a big victory. It's hard for me to imagine that any American leader, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, is going to allow that to happen. It's just not going to happen. We are too deeply committed to this war. There's too much Russophobia in the United States. There's too much talk about the fact that this is an existential threat that we're facing with Russia for us to cut and run and allow Ukraine to go under. Furthermore, just think about what the consequences will be for China. Our credibility, people will argue, will be destroyed if we allow Ukraine to lose.
So Mearsheimer, regardless of what you may think of him and his opinions about the Ukraine war when it began, seems to have the opinion that the United States is too committed to a Ukrainian victory in this war, and that Russia or a Russian victory represents an existential threat to the United States, and points up that a Russian victory would destroy American credibility internationally, specifically with regards to China. Now let's have a look at what someone like Michael McFaul, who is a liberal, has to say about the Ukraine war. For those who haven't heard of him, he's a former ambassador to Russia from the United States, and he's currently a professor, I think, at Stanford University.
How
They've chosen to say, okay, this is not our war. You know, there's certain presidential candidates saying this is a regional conflict, so I'm told. Had they chosen to go by that pathway, the stakes for us might have been different. But now that we're in, as much as we are, it means the stakes are even greater. Because if we, God forbid, Putin wins, and we'll talk about what the definition of that is, I'm sure, in a minute. But if somehow Putin wins and he achieves his objectives, that is a giant setback for us. Had we stayed on the sidelines, maybe it'd be less. But now that we're all in, we're not all in. We're in, and we should be all in, from my perspective. I think the stakes are even higher. And for two reasons. One, nobody, well, historians remember, but most people don't remember who was winning the war in year one. They remember who is winning the war, or who won the war in the final year. And nobody is going to give President Biden any credit for everything he did in 2022 if Putin wins in 2024, 2025. So I think their stakes, personally, President Biden and our country, the stakes are high. And number two, it's related, as you said, to Asia. I radically disagree with this argument that some make that, well, the war in Europe is not really important. The war that's coming with China and Taiwan is the really important one. I think these things are intertwined. If Putin is defeated in Ukraine, that's a win for Ukrainians, it's a win for European security, and it's a win for our values, and the tide might change. We've been in a 15-year recession with respect to democracy around the world, according to Freedom House. That says that maybe momentum's on our side, and maybe the 40 countries that are on the sidelines are going to lean a little bit towards us, and maybe Xi Jinping might think a little bit harder in terms of his military planning vis-a-vis Taiwan. By the way, I was in Taiwan 4 or 5 months ago. There's no people on the planet cheering for the Ukrainians to win to a greater extent than the Taiwanese, because they understand this relationship. Conversely, if Putin wins and he gets to annex territory, and we allow that to happen, and he gets to subjugate a country on his borders, that has all kinds of negative consequences exactly the opposite way around the world. So tragically, I think the stakes are really, really high.
So what does McFaul have to say about the Ukraine war at this point? Well, he points out that the stakes are too high to allow Ukraine to fail, and he points out that Russian victory would have all kinds of negative impacts. Essentially, he's in agreement with Mearsheimer about where this war must go. Ukraine must win. I think if a liberal like McFaul and a realist like Mearsheimer agree on international affairs, you should be worried. Darren Gerdes is a professor at Charleston Southern University, and he's a pro-Ukrainian YouTuber. He has some things to say about the significance of the war in Ukraine with regards to American policymakers that aligns with the previous comments.
Zelensky said that if Ukraine loses, either there's going to be a larger war or NATO might collapse, and both of those are very possible if Ukraine loses. This is why I can't understand American politicians who are like, nah, not our problem. You don't understand. This could be a huge problem for you.
The comments made by Gerdes caused me to look up Zelensky's comments about the collapse of NATO or war as the American choices for the future if Ukraine loses. And I provided a link to the article for anyone interested. Now, Zelensky's position is one that I've heard before, but breaks down into that Russia won't stop at taking Ukraine. It will invade Poland and the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, essentially will continue to advance after Ukraine. And that will lead to either war or the collapse of NATO. I don't think that's particularly plausible. I don't think that Russia, despite what several people have claimed on YouTube particularly, who are respected and do have lots of paperwork to back up their right to assert things. I don't think that's a very, very realistic situation. And I think it really does break down into the status issue that is mentioned by people like Mearsheimer and McFall. Now, for a more West European perspective on the Ukraine war at this time, I'd like to show a clip made by Anders Puck Nielsen, who is a military analyst in Denmark and pretty commonly commenting on the Ukraine war on YouTube.
All this is just to show how impossible it is to imagine a peace deal at this point. In reality, Putin's ambitions are much bigger than these minimum demands that I have mentioned here. But my point is that if we're not willing to give at least these things to Russia, then it's silly to imagine any kind of negotiations. And of course, all these demands are absolute non-starters for both Ukraine and for the West. And that's also why I think we have come to a point where the war cannot stop as long as Putin is president. It has to continue, because that is the only way that he can keep the grip on power in Russia. The war has sort of become Putin's political project, so now it has to continue. And if we look at the war in Ukraine now, then in the big perspective, that means that there are basically only two ways that this can go. Like, either Putin stops being the president of Russia, or else the war does not end.
Now, I'll come back to Nielsen again later, but I want to point out that I think it's pretty clear that Nielsen is making a case for regime change in Russia, and that that's the only way to end this war. In other words, Russia must lose this war. And that aligns with American perspectives on the war. Now let's have a look at a comment made by Peter Zeihan, who is a geopolitical analyst and a public intellectual on YouTube, and what he has to say about the possibilities of regime change in Russia.
So even a democratic Russia could very much choose to continue to prosecute the conflict.
I think Zeihan has a point that regime change in and of itself is unlikely to end the war in Ukraine, and that Russia, under a new leader, may very well continue fighting because the stakes are just too high at this point to do otherwise. So let's have a look at the Russian perspective on the war in Ukraine. Got a clip of an interview by Ian Bremmer of Dmitry Trenin that makes the strong case for the implications of the war in Ukraine for Russia.
Given that Russia is essentially fighting by itself with Belarus against, the most powerful military actors in the world, doesn't this imply that the Russian leadership needs to have a sense of reality for its own people, for its own survival, for its own long-term perspectives, and therefore needs to be more modest about what it thinks it can actually accomplish?
Well, Ian, I think that the Russian leadership and the bulk of the Russian people have a sense of history. So this is not the first time that Russia has been confronted by, let's say, the combined forces of the West. This is the first time, however, that Russia has no allies in the West. We had allies in both 1812 and 1941 wars. Britain in the first case, and the United States and Britain in the other one. This time, the entire West is against Russia. That is ascribed to the success of U.S. foreign policy, to the success of U.S. call it hegemony, call it dominance, call it leadership, whatever you want to call it. The United States has the power, and it has shown that power, to mobilize the West against Russia. I think this supports the thesis that this war is of existential importance for Russia. Either it protects its national security interest in Ukraine and more widely in Europe's east, or the future of Russia will be very bleak.
Now, Trent makes the point that Russia is fighting alone and that the entire West is against Russia. And I think what is truly important is that he refers to this war as being of existential importance to Russia, and that losing this war would imply a very bleak future for Russia.
Of course, the war can't continue at this current level, of intensity, but it can develop into a kind of frozen conflict where there is a lower intensity level and it becomes sort of sustainable for both parts to replace their losses, and then maybe the war can just continue forever.
Nielsen seems to be making a case here for, I'm actually not sure what Nielsen is talking about in suggesting that a conventional war can turn into a frozen conflict. I think his point of reference, because a lot of people started calling the Crimean and Donbass conflicts frozen conflicts, but I want to point out those conflicts were frozen by treaty. You know, on second thought, I think the whole discussion of frozen conflict refers to the idea that something like the UN will step in and negotiate a settlement that isn't satisfactory, that doesn't end the disputes. But that just is not realistic, primarily because 4 out of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations are engaged in this conflict. And it is unlikely that any of them would approve UN intervention. As a matter of fact, they're usually the ones who intervene. For example, in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the war fighting was brought to a conclusion by great power intervention through the UN. I have difficulty imagining a situation in which that could happen in the Ukraine war this year, or next year, or ever, really. Effectively, the idea that this conflict can lead to another frozen conflict like 2014 or 2015 seems very unrealistic, because the conventional war has been going on for more than a year now, and there's every expectation that it will continue for at least another year, and there's a possibility that one or the other side will start to lose. And loss in this situation is what we need to think about. Now let's have a look at what Peter Zeihan, who is a public intellectual and formerly a geopolitical analyst, has to say about the war in Ukraine and how it can end.
The idea of an off-ramp for Putin and the Russian government. Is there a way that this war can end without either side being completely defeated? And the answer is flat no. At this point, Russia has paid the price for a major war, but got none of the benefits, and it's actually in a worse strategic position than it was when it started. So the Russians are all in. In addition, any meaningful peace would have to require a degree of reparations and admittance of guilt.
While I debate whether Russia is presently all in for the war in Ukraine, there's certainly no question that the language is very similar to what's discussed about the United States. Ambassador McFall, for example, used similar language and indicated that the United States should be all in. So I don't think Zeihan is off the mark in terms of the commitment to winning this war, and he makes the point, and it's an important one, that the war can't end without a clear victory for one side or the other. And I think it's important to recognize that his position is equally applicable to Ukraine as it is to Russia. So what does it all mean? I think that both sides are now so heavily invested in victory that defeat is unthinkable. And there is a significant amount of escalation that's possible. Russia could fully mobilize for war, and NATO could intervene. Is that likely? At the moment, no, because Ukraine isn't succeeding overwhelmingly well, and neither is Russia. But this is a conventional war, and conventional wars simply can't last. And I think the weight of the evidence suggests that this war can only end in a complete victory for one side or the other. And the United States and its NATO allies are invested in a Ukrainian victory on Ukrainian terms. Russia is equally determined to keep the territorial gains that it has made in Ukraine and possibly expand upon them. This is a recipe for an escalation. Possibly the most extreme example of escalation that has been floated recently was by Anders Rasmussen, who was a NATO Secretary General previously, who back on June 7th, 2023, suggested that some NATO member countries might send troops to Ukraine if Ukraine didn't get security guarantees of some sort. This is probably little more than bluster at this point, but it's worth keeping in mind that that is something that a year ago would have been effectively unthinkable. So that's something to keep in mind. This may seem like a pretty pessimistic analysis of the future of the war in Ukraine. And it is. But I think a lot of people are now being schooled in the realities of international relations, something that they have more or less forgotten about in the last 30 years. I don't know how it'll turn out, and anyone who suggests they do know how it'll turn out don't. So let's hope for the best and expect the worst. I wish I had a happy way to end this. I don't think there is, unfortunately. I think if Russia loses, the odds are that NATO will have to secure the territory of Russia. And I think that's why nobody actually wants to be engaged, because there's a really fine balance here that's being presented to the world. On the one hand, I think there's clear determination to maintain the world order that has existed for the last 30 years. And on the other hand, there is a strong desire to maintain Russia as a viable state. Whether those two can be accomplished, I don't know.